What are the symptoms that a company is in trouble? This is important even if you don't have a company, because things get worse before they get better. At the beginning, you are putting in a lot of money and you have all kinds of problems and you don't have the experience, you don't have an established base of clientele. And then if you survive for a year or two, things start getting a lot more stable and they start getting a lot better. But you just have to make it through this initial point. And these things are not a problem. Financial issues are not a problem as long as you recognize them early on and you don't start doing terrible things like not submitting your sales taxes and spending the last dime that you have in the bank account and taking merchant cash advances and potentially borrowing on your credit card and doing all kinds of things that are going to get you buried. So the important thing is recognizing early on you're in over your head and then just getting out so that you have enough time to readjust and get back to business. And the people who are on top of their finances and who do this don't tend to have nearly as much problems as people who are blind optimists. So this is some of the typical problems people have, and we're going to talk about ways to stop yourself from getting in this, is being regularly behind on servicing your debt, being late on your taxes, unable to cover repairs or replacements of equipment, cannot pay salaries, cash flow issues, sales are flat or declining, material costs are going up, employees quitting because they're depressed because they see what's going on in the company, and so on and so forth. Those are the kinds of issues that can creep up on you. So now these are some of the first contracts that you're going to be signing. And these contracts come with substantial risks that you may not be aware of even if you hire a lawyer. By far the most dangerous contract you're going to sign is your commercial lease agreement. We're going to get in a little more into this later, but commercial lease agreements are so dangerous for several reasons. The first thing is they're expensive. Your commercial lease could easily be a minimum of $2,500 for a very small space. I have a lot of clients who are starting out who are paying $8,500 a month because they're in manufacturing and they need to be in a little bit better location with a little bit better facilities and closer to the people who would buy the product. And so they have no choice. And now that's fine because people have a budget, but what happens is that's not the only expense in a commercial lease. That can be the base rent. Then on top of that, there's going to be a lot of other expenses built in, including your share of the increase in the landlord's rent, your share of utilities, your share of maintenance, your share of taxes. I'm sorry, did I say rent? I meant taxes, the landlord's taxes before. So you're going to be facing all of these things in addition to the base rent. So that can get very expensive. And what's worse is if you're unable to pay any of these things, or if the landlord alleges that you owe expenses that you don't owe, then the acceleration clause ends up kicking in, which means you owe all the money on the commercial lease right up front. So you may be paying $5,000 a month over 10 years, but now all of a sudden in month 3 there's a dispute and you owe $5,000 times 120 months all at once. And the landlord is now suing you for a 6-digit sum, and you're sitting here like, how did we get to this point? And it happens that easily. I had someone who called me, and this was an interesting example, where his commercial lease specified that he pays his prorated share of the total amount of space in the building for utilities. So in other words, if he's got 10% of the space in the building, he pays 10% of the total utility costs for the building. Sounds fine, until the landlord decided to rent to a car wash next door. And so what happened? The car wash is going nuts using water and electricity, and it wouldn't surprise me if the landlord owned the car wash. And so what ends up happening is they say, all right, you need to pay your 10%. And he's like, whoa, 10% of the car wash's expenses? Are they giving me 10% of the cash they're taking in down there? No way, dude, read your lease. And so he calls, what am I going to do now? Like, I don't know, because this is not residential where you have a lot of protections. This is commercial where whatever the lease says is what they're going to enforce. So when you look at a contract that's been evaluated by a good lawyer versus a contract that's been evaluated by a not so good lawyer, the difference is like every line is going to have some form of editing in it, because every line is so dangerous and it's all stacked against you. So, I mean, a lot of times, like when I finish going through a lease, there's just pages and pages of red line. And then the landlord will say, well, a lot of lawyers just signed it the way it is. I'm like, and 8 out of 10 small businesses go out of business. What's your point here? You know, we're going to figure something out, but we have to make sure that everything is commercially reasonable, that there's some way out of it, and so on and so forth. So that I've dedicated this time to talking about that, because commercial leases are dangerous. And I do a lot of bankruptcy, and this is the #1 reason people file bankruptcy, is to kill off their liability, their personal liability on their commercial lease, because the landlords typically insist that you sign personally in order to get the lease so they can hold you liable. Now, there's ways to negotiate around that by putting up more security, or by putting in a clause known as a good guy clause, which basically states that you can leave after giving the landlord a certain amount of notice, and you'll be personally liable up until that point. But after that point, you no longer have personal liability. There's still things the landlord can do, but you have to try to negotiate these things ahead of time. Next thing is employment contracts. The city council here in New York City passes new employee rights laws. It seems like every week nowadays. And the state is also pretty busy. The federal government, not as much, but the federal government's been going for a lot longer. The federal government has a lot more experience with these laws. And while it may seem wonderful as an employee, and there's a lot of wonderful things about it, the problem is that the penalties for even a technical violation of a lot of these laws don't fit the crime. You might not pay an employee for overtime because you did not even know they were working overtime. And then all of a sudden, someone calls up the government and they say, I worked 100 hours of overtime and I was not paid. And you're like, what overtime? I would never allow overtime. And the law still specifies that even if you didn't know about it, you're still liable for it. So then you show up before the Department of Labor like, oh, you've done a bad thing. Like, but I had no idea. And it doesn't matter. You still broke the law. And so then people end up showing up and like, I got this nasty fine from the Department of Labor. I can't pay this. And so we need to figure out what we're going to do. You know, I'm not going to get into employment agreements here, but you just need to be very careful. You either need to use a very good lawyer or be very good at using Google, and make sure that you specify, or that you have a good employee handbook, and that you specify in the contract that there's no overtime without specific written permission from the company, and that you enforce that rule by not allowing people to stay late. If you see any evidence that people have been doing work after hours, you need to say, I appreciate that, but you have to stick to your hours. And this can be very insidious, because at the beginning, when you're struggling, everyone is cheering you on. The employees are working a lot of extra hours. Everyone's trying to help you because everyone wants you to succeed, because everyone wants you to be successful, just not more successful than they are. But that turns around really quickly after praying and starving and praying and starving and working and all of these things. One day you just get a good break. Something positive happens, and you get a nice order and your situation gets a little bit better. And then all of a sudden everyone is like, wow, that's a pretty nice order. And they don't know what you've been going through. They don't know how behind you are on your SBA loans. They don't know what your credit card bill looks like. They don't know any of these things. Everyone's just talking to each other like, whoa, did you see that order that just came in? I think raises are coming. And then you're like, I'm not in a position to give a raise. People are like, but I worked so hard for you. I worked 90 hours a week. I'm entitled to overtime. And then all of a sudden, and this is just one of 100 things that people can bring up. When I say one of 100, I'm being conservative. There's probably 10,000 things you can think of if that's what you want to do. So basically, once you start to become even a little successful, everybody's out to get you. That's what it's going to be. And so, welcome. I like to say to people, I've got good news and I've got bad news for you about starting a business. The good news is that if you're committed and you want to make 1 million or 5 million or 10 million, you'll do it. You will be able to. This is a great country. This is a great city. There's a lot of money here, and it's completely doable. Many people have sat in this room who have gone on to make millions, and that's not the last group of people who've sat in this room and done exactly that. That's the good news. The bad news is when you get there, you'll probably be bitter and angry and injured and resentful and not appreciative of the point that you've gotten, because so many relationships will have been destroyed by that point. So many people will have broken your heart, including people in your family, your best friends. Everyone that you can think of that should have your back will put another knife into it with 99% probability, which is why so many rich people are so nasty and selfish. Like, they didn't start that way a lot of the time, but it's just been one knife after the next, and eventually people just walk around like, what are you gonna do to me now? And, so that's the good news and that's the bad news about how success typically works. Then you've got independent contractor agreements. Very important point here. When you've got an independent contractor agreement, you have to make sure that there's a work for hire clause when you hire someone. If you don't have that, then they're going to own the intellectual property for the work that you've done, for the work that you've paid them to do. It may be a lot of your ideas, but if they're the one who made it tangible, then they're going to be the ones who own it. Now, like, you might have a computer app company or something like that where this could be highly problematic because you can't afford to have an employee doing your coding. You hire an outside contractor to do the coding. You have all these ideas, they code the whole thing up, you pay them for the work, and then all of a sudden, they're out selling the app to 20 other people. Like, dude, what are you doing? It's like, oh, well, it's mine, I wrote it, literally, I wrote it, it's mine. Like, so you, as the person who thought of it and paid them, you have a limited license to use it. You can use it for your business, but they're gonna be more the owner than you are unless you change that with a work for hire clause. And there's a lot of companies, particularly web hosting companies and development companies. Small businesses don't usually do this, but larger businesses love to do it, where they'll literally extort you for your own property. You go to change web hosting companies or something like that. They take out the contract and they'll be like, well, we own every line of code that you posted to your website. Well, how is that possible? Well, did you read the contract? And you have an outside agreement with them, and that's just the way it works. So point being, you need to be very careful about this kind of thing too, where you could find yourself in difficult negotiations over that. Similarly, you need to make sure that your independent contractors don't claim to be your employee. This is a very common thing. There's something called the badges that they look at to determine if someone is a 1099 contractor or a W-2 employee. You should have an agreement specifying that someone is a contractor, but regardless, if they're acting more like an employee than an independent contractor, they can nail you to the wall for not having all the proper benefits and not giving the proper paid time off and all this stuff because they were actually an employee. And that can come out in a very unfortunate situation. So you really just need to be careful. Like, if you've got someone working 40 hours a week for you and they're sitting in your office and you're telling them what to do, if it's just obvious that they're your employee, then you want to just make them a W-2 employee sooner rather than later. If someone is on a shorter duration and they've got other clients and basically your common sense tells you that they don't work for you, that as soon as you stop paying, they go back to their other accounts, then you're fine. Then you're dealing with a 1099 contractor. And I have a lot of people come into me who are like, I've got whatever they have. I've got 19 employees that are all classified as 1099 contractors. What do I do now? Do I go to the government and confess that I've been breaking the law for a really long time? Or do I just change everyone to a W-2, which is going to reduce their pay? What do I do from here? And it becomes a very tricky situation. We really have to evaluate the risks, and bottom line is it ends up costing the business owner a lot of money, because every mistake just costs you a lot of money, because you just have to pay somebody not to make your life a living hell. And that's just what it comes down to. So next thing, liability insurance. The secret to understand with insurance is that insurance companies are in the business of taking your money and not paying out when you have a claim. That's what they want to do. That's what they're in the profession of doing. What does that mean? That means that you can get whatever insurance that you want to get, a lot of times at whatever price you want to get it at, because they'll encourage you to lie. Like the brokers will sit there and be like, so what is your budget? And then they'll just fill out the form for you. They'll make mistakes and check off the things that give you the lowest possible premium. And they'll be like, I found a carrier who will do this for $1,200 a year. Isn't that great? Everyone else wanted $18,000. And that's great until there's a claim. And then the insurance company is just going to be like, all right, can we see evidence of everything that you wrote in your application? And if anything turns out not to be true, then you're finished. They're not going to pay the claim. And in fact, the New York State Bar Association recently published a very interesting case where there was a cooperative corporation, what's known as a co-op. And what ended up happening was the management company saved some money by saying they had sprinklers everywhere, that legally they needed to have the sprinklers, but they did not have those sprinklers there. And the co-op, the whole building burned to the ground. They had a fire. And the co-op said, how about them sprinklers? Let's see the evidence that they were working. And they were like, well, they were mostly working. And they said, if they weren't all working, we never would have written that policy. And guess who won? The insurance company. They paid zero. Everybody lost their home. They weren't covered. Done. So point being, on one side, you've got to be very careful to be honest on your insurance applications, or you're not going to have insurance. On the other hand, you need to understand just how expensive insurance can get. A lot of people get great government contracts, and they're so excited. Yes, I'm getting $1 million to do the electric for this building, whatever it is that the contract is. And it's their first time, and they just don't realize how expensive insurance is. In construction, the liability insurance, like the workers' comp, can be more money than the person's whole salary easily, because most people who work in construction end up going on disability. So they need to charge you a fortune. Liability insurance can be very, very costly. At the end of the day, the insurance can be so expensive that people can't fulfill the contract, and they need to go bankrupt to get out of their government contract because the insurance is just choking them. So same thing with my favorite thing again, the commercial lease agreements. Landlords love to just put in all of these requirements for insurance, because look, it's better if you just buy all the landlord's insurance and you buy insurance for everything. That just lets the landlord sleep so much better. That's just great. But the problem is a lot of these policies cost tens of thousands of dollars. And when I'm reviewing a commercial lease for a client, the first thing I do is I take the insurance page and I send it to their favorite insurance broker if they have one. I say, all right, can you give us a quote on this? Tell me like what each of these things is going to cost. And the brokers are usually like, whoa, that's expensive. And they'll give us a list. This is going to cost $10,000 a year. This is $4,000 a year. This rider is $6,000 a year. And when I send it to the person, they're like, I can't pay that. I said, of course not. That's why I had you do this ahead of time, because I didn't want you to get into the lease and then find out that you're bound to some kind of policy requirement that you could never in a million years fulfill. And you'll be in default from the day that you sign the lease. And if you think they're going to let you out, how wrong you are. So, all right. So what else? There's investor and venture capital agreements. The thing you need to understand with angel capital, venture capital, anything like that, is that no one's on your side. If you have a good business, if you have a good idea, if you're profitable, it's going to be very easy to get venture capital or angel capital because everyone's looking for a good return on their money. Everybody wants to be part of a profitable business. So the problem is that, they'll take you out for dinner and for really expensive drinks and tell you, we're going to put $1 million in your business, we're going to put $5 million in your business, we're going to put $10 million in your business. And what actually happens, like everything else, if you don't know what to expect, you end up losing hook, line, and sinker. The first thing that happens is you typically don't get a check for that $1 million or $5 million or $10 million. They'll invest, you have more like a line of credit that they'll release as they feel it's justified. So, you might get $100,000 to start with the venture capitalist fully controlling the board and your salary. And then if they want to put in another $100,000 or another $500,000, they might need more stock in exchange for doing that. They're going to have all kinds of rules in there that basically take away a substantial portion of the founder's upside potential in this whole deal. So when you're going to take venture capital, depending on what the terms are, a lot of times you're going to want off the table money, meaning you look at how many of your rights are being stripped away. And you say, okay, you know what? For this level of giving up my rights, I need $1 million now, or I need $500,000 now, or I need $2 million now, or whatever it is. They say, well, you're not going to be hungry anymore if we give you a check for $1 million or $2 million. That's usually what the answer is. Say, listen, I'm talking to 10 venture capital firms. You're asking me to remain an employee of this company until we have a $50 million exit or a $100 million exit or something that may never happen. In the meantime, if the company doesn't do as well, you're just going to forget about it. And I'm going to be a slave to this thing. So for me to take that level of risk, I'm going to need to ask you for a certain amount of compensation, almost like you're the insurance company, like you're writing the policy for them that you're going to stick around come hell or high water. So if you're going to do that, you need the insurance premium right out of there. And you'll have the negotiating power to ask for that because typically no one's even thinking to give you venture capital unless you're showing great potential. And if you are, they're going to be flocking around you like vultures, all trying to get in on the action because of the profitability or the growth in traffic or whatever it is. So it's really like, 0 or 100, like feast or famine kind of situation. So, again, you got to just be careful with that. If you're going to buy a franchise or a business, you got to keep in mind that people don't usually sell profitable, successful businesses. Usually people sell because the industry is being disrupted. Something is going wrong. There's lawsuits on the horizon, whatever that person's case is. So typically when you buy a business, you should be paying a lot less than it feels like the business is worth. And then you can agree on some kind of an earnout over time. Like in other words, someone wants $400,000 for the business. Okay, I'm going to put down $50,000 now, and I'll pay out $350,000 from the proceeds of the business. So if it turns out that the business is only worth $50,000, hopefully it's not worth less than that. But if it's only worth that, you're not going to be stuck having taken a loan for all of this money that you can't pay back. Now, this is the thing with franchises. I was doing some research into how franchises work for some of my clients, and basically it works like this. A lot of these franchises are front-loaded, meaning you invest a lot of money up front and then you get your money back over time. So the franchise helps you to get a loan. You have to have a certain amount of liquidity. And then the franchise helps you to go get a loan, usually some kind of an SBA-backed loan or whatever it is. So you get a loan for $100,000, $200,000, $400,000. Where does it go? It goes straight to the franchisor. It goes straight to the person's pocket, whoever owns the franchise. And then you need to go and fund the business. And hopefully you're going to start making a profit sooner rather than later. But you've got all of that money sunk now, right up front. So you've really got to be diligent about this. Now, there's also a lot of franchise brokers who are advertising everywhere who, seem to be very helpful. They know just what you need. Now, keep this in mind. The good franchises, the ones that you've heard of, the ones that you love, they don't typically work with franchise brokers because they don't need to. McDonald's doesn't have trouble finding people who want to open a McDonald's. Kinko's doesn't have trouble finding someone who wants to open a Kinko's, a FedEx Kinko's. It's these smaller franchises that no one's ever heard of that very well may go out of business. They're the ones that are paying franchise brokers to go and find them and find them people. And the franchise brokers make a lot of money, which is why they're so motivated, kind of like real estate brokers. And the franchises charge a lot of fees. And again, it's this whole finance system. Everyone's profiting when you take that big loan, the highest loan that you're able to get with your credit, right up front, and you pay it over to the franchise. That's when everybody is making bank, so to speak. So that's a reason why generally I'm not in favor of franchises, unless you just have the money to open a McDonald's or some major franchise, because you're going to do all this stuff. Then, like say for example, take Papa John's. I had somebody call me, and he invested his life savings in a Papa John's. And the CEO of Papa John's, you all remember this, he just decided to go shoot off his mouth and say something really stupid. What happened? A lot of people stopped going to Papa John's. And my client, who owned a Papa John's, was himself a minority, and he was like, this is just such an unfair situation to me, because I invested in a Papa John's. This guy did this. I'm now totally broke because no one's going to Papa John's anymore. And if he didn't have a franchise, if he just had like Louis' Pizza Shop on the corner, this wouldn't have happened to him, because as long as he conducted himself in a professional fashion, people would eat his pizza and people would like his pizza, and he'd never know the difference. But because he put everything into that Papa John's brand, and then Papa John's had a PR problem, boom, he's out of business just like that. And so he wants to sue Papa John's, of course. And that's a whole separate case. But in the meantime, he can't even pay the rent to take care of his family, because of this. And that's only one of many ways that you can go under with a franchise. You have to read the franchise disclosure agreement very carefully. I'm sorry, not the agreement. It's called the FDD, the franchise disclosure document, and that tells you how many lawsuits they're in, how many franchises have been taken back, and all of these other things that are relevant if you're thinking to get into the franchising business. But at any rate, if you can, you're just a lot better if you're going to take that big loan, just building your own brand, investing in yourself, spending it the right way, and not giving it to people for any reason at all. Commercial lease agreements we already talked about. Basically, as you read it over, everything you see in the commercial lease is going to go against you. And pretty much everything is reversible after you sign the lease for a fee. This is purely a financial situation. So if you want to get out of the lease, if you want to assign the lease, if you want to put up a bigger sign, everything you want to do is going to be a problem until you pay for it. Then the skies clear up and the sun is bright and everything will start going your way as soon as you're able to pay for it. So you really got to read that lease carefully and think about what are your risks and make sure that you have some kind of a way out. Employment agreements, we talked a bit about employment agreements. You also have to be careful that you have clauses in there such as the non-disclosure, the non-compete, and these are important. The non-disclosure stops your employees from going to a competitor with all of your trade secrets for a higher hourly rate, because someone else is like, oh, they're doing pretty well. What are they doing? They're like, well, for $30 an hour, I'll be happy to tell you what they're doing and help you do it even better. And if you don't have a non-disclosure, you're going to have a really hard time stopping them from doing that. Non-compete, a lot of employees will go out and start the same business as you, because while you're out struggling and trying to bring in customers, they're sitting there schmoozing with the customers, building relationships, getting to know all about what they like and dislike. And then they just go and they call the customer, like, I'll do the same work for you for half the price. I'm starting my own firm. Why don't you come with me? And the customers are going to be like, oh, sure, you're the person who's been doing all the work for me. Of course, I don't need like that person over there just taking half the profit. And there's no reason. Of course I want to work with you. So if you don't have a non-compete, that's going to happen. Non-solicitation means you can't go take your colleagues and quit at the same time. That's really a disaster, is when your 3 best employees all leave to go start a competing business at the same time, because there's just some kind of a good versus evil dynamic when you're the business owner. Like the employees all feel like, they're the good and you're like the evil boss. And so a lot of times the employees want to go start a business together because they all feel like they're reasonable people and you're terrible. Once they get into business together, they end up in litigation with each other because it's just not that way. But people don't realize that, and so that can be disastrous when you lose like your manager, your chief technician, and your chief salesperson all at the same time because one person decided to go start a business or one person decided to leave the company, and then they're getting a commission to solicit other good people, especially in an economy like this. It can just be catastrophic. And so you need to have all of these clauses in there, non-disparagement. You don't want people going on Glassdoor and trashing you if you can. And there's really an attitude among people, much more now than even 10 years ago, of complete self-entitlement and complete lack of empathy for anyone else. So I've represented a lot of clients in this kind of a situation. And so I'll say to them, you know, it's not really okay to just take all of the company's files and take them over to another firm that's paying you more money and then directly go into competition. And they'll say to me, okay, but I don't care about that. My only question is, where does it say in the contract that I can't do that? And what can you do to me if I do that anyway? Can we have that honest discussion? And I said, sure, we can have the honest discussion. It's not my business. I'm the lawyer. Let me tell you what's going to happen. And then I have to show them where in the contract it says that they can't do that exact thing. And hopefully there's some kind of indemnification clause to say, well, I'm going to sue you for that. The lawsuit is going to be a public record. You're probably going to need to pay the legal fees because you're probably going to lose. I'm also going to sue the company that you're working with. And so you're probably going to lose that job that you have. And a lot of other people are not going to want to hire you because you're going to have a public record as a thief. So if I were you, I would not want to do that for a variety of reasons. And then most times people are like, oh, so there's actually a pretty big downside to this. I'll say, yeah. And they'll say, okay, I think I'm not going to do it. I just didn't understand what I signed. I wish I did not sign that contract. I did not understand because I think that what I want to do is the right thing to do. So I wouldn't have signed this if I had known. Say, it's okay. You wouldn't have, and next time you won't. But this time that you did, so I ask you to obey the law and make all of our lives that much easier. And most people are receptive to that. Most people are afraid of getting sued when they know that they're actually going to lose. Not everyone. Some people are just like, do what you have to do. Like maybe 10% of the people have that reaction. But 90% of the people are like, all right, let's roll back a little bit. So, okay. These are the things we talked about earlier, the independent contractor agreements that you need to be careful about. You're also going to have a lot of issues when you're doing internet kind of work and you have people in different jurisdictions. You have to make sure that you're satisfying the employment law if you have employees in whatever jurisdiction that person happens to be in. In some of my companies that I've run in the past, we had employees in Canada and Mexico and many different states. And the just group of employment laws that we have to satisfy was incredibly challenging because cities make their own employment laws, as you know. So, you know, we might have 60 employees in 60 different cities, and trying to keep track of all these employment laws, my goodness, it's a full-time job. But you can't break one, because if you break one, like even if you're in New York, you'll have the city of San Francisco suing you for $1 million. Like, well, you had an employee in San Francisco. San Francisco law applies to people who live in San Francisco. So the city of San Francisco is seeking $1 million in damages because you're a company with over 50 employees, which puts you within makes you a San Francisco large employer, and you failed to provide mandatory ABC, whatever it is, that became the law 2 weeks ago. You've been reported, and now that has not happened to me because we managed to comply with all of these laws. It was my full-time job to do that. But it happens to companies all the time. They're totally taken by surprise. So when you hire employees in other places, you have to be careful. Liability insurance, again, you need to understand what you're buying. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just a quick question about the non-solicitation.
Mm-hmm.